Hi, everybody. I'm Farm Director Terry Henne from WSGW Radio. Along with me, Joe Cramer and Scott Bales, and we are talking beans through the courtesy of BASF. Guys, I hope you're having a good day so far. It's beautiful weather out today.
So far, so good. It sounds like it's going to get a little chillier.
Yeah, we're looking at it, a little bit chillier weather, but they did take that cold weather and the chance of snow out of the forecast for Thanksgiving. So I think we need to be thankful for a lot more things, at least one more thing, the weather anyway. Speaking of the weather, both of you, I'm sure, have watched the weather do what it does best during the planting season, the growing season, and the harvest season of our dry edible beans here in Michigan. And Joe, without further ado, we're going to slide over to Scott here because Scott Bales kind of walk us through the season from the planting till what we have seen in the fields and what your research paper is going to show, because that'll be coming up here pretty quick, won't it?
Yeah, that's for sure, Terry. And you say every year is different, and it's really coming to be true. This season, we started off historically dry, as some of us have kind of forgotten after we got through the mid-season. But we're really abnormally dry, through that first, 6 weeks, from May 1 until mid-June at least. And come, 4th of July, it seems like we finally turned that faucet on for some water and some rainfall, which was very well needed. And it never really stopped, through the majority of our growing season. We had great moisture for pod fill, and unfortunately excessive moisture in some places through mid-season. And then it was a little bit of a struggle of a harvest season. I think things ended up, much better than expected, with relatively minimal drying of the crop. But it was definitely a wet finish. And as we've transitioned into November, it seems like the weather's actually been quite a bit nicer than it was in September and October when we were trying to wrap up this season.
Now, we not only had Mother Nature to contend with, but we had the human element. We had a lot of smoke that came down through the state of Michigan from our friends in Canada. And I know as far as the growing degrees are concerned, we did wind up quite a bit below where we more than likely should have been when it came to the base 50 growing degrees. Did that have much of an effect on our dry beans?
That's definitely true, Terry. There's a lot of conversation about what the effect of smoke actually was. And unfortunately, that's a pretty difficult thing for us to test to have a solid answer. But what we do know is the crop, progressed anywhere from 10 to 14 days, later than normal, considering our planting dates, development. And I believe it's a combination of factors, between excessive moisture, smoke probably plays a role, some cooler temperatures in there, as we talked about that base 50 growing degree days, all these things that, help us develop. We're a little bit lacking, which isn't always a bad thing, but we were definitely a little bit later in the season than we would have anticipated, with an early planting season. We had growers that were finishing up planting, that last week of May, which is really unprecedented for us. We thought we would have been much further ahead in our harvest season, but really it ended up being more normal than anticipated.
Did we have any normal, or maybe I shouldn't say normal, but unpredictable challenges with our dry beans this year?
We definitely did. And those, to me, would be linked to moisture once again. Depending on where exactly we were in the States, some were more blessed than others. Some regions, we had 1-inch rains for 3 weeks in a row. That was really challenging for a somewhat water-sensitive crop like dry beans. And water logging, or that anoxic soil conditions, is something really difficult for us to manage after we're already in the season. There's really not much that we can do. But that was a big challenge that was quite unpredictable, depending on where those storm cells came across. And once again, that excessive moisture led to some disease challenges that we did have. Overall, I felt we were fairly well prepared for those. We've seen this moisture coming. We know that can drive our issue. Cool temperatures, low growing degree days, excessive moisture. We know that that's a recipe for disease when we talk about things like white mold, anthracnose, and even some of our bacterial diseases. So that's something that definitely came up in late season, but fortunately we were prepared, with our fungicide programs and management to keep that, relatively at bay given the conditions.
As far as regions, areas, and of course, Joe, I'm sure you were exposed to it when by the end of August, we had a pretty good idea from the different field plots who was having challenges and who wasn't. Can you kind of pinpoint those areas where we had some major problems and in other areas where we didn't, and the yields proved that those regions had a good season?
There definitely were some winners and losers in those in that geography. And Scott and I spent the whole summer, didn't we, Scott, just talking about where's it good, where's it bad. And I don't know how accurate this would be, but I kind of drew I think it's a rectangle more, kind of a Reese to Seawing line over to Owendale, back down to Carroll, back to Reese, and said, that area's got some water damage in it for sure. There's some areas just outside of that line or square, but yeah, those areas they got beat up pretty good. We know of some guys that worked some beans down in July. Other guys that they lost a third or half of a field. I think if you go to Bay County, you can find some damage in there too. But at the same time, it seemed like in a field where we looked at that and called it, boy, I hope it makes 20 bags. The beans around that drowned out spot did really well. And I think that brought our average yield up and various growers' average yields up a little bit. When you get over in Montcalm County in the colored bean region, also some water damage over there. But if you drew in contrast, if you drew a line, use M142 across the tip of the thumb and maybe down the east edge a little bit of Huron County, it's almost like some areas there had two crops in one, some tremendous yields up in that region. So I think the growers north of 142, they're pretty happy today with the way things turned out. Wouldn't you agree, Scott?
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and I'll try to share a screen here to kind of put some numbers to that. Because what we do is we run a 4-location variety testing program. Are you guys looking at my screen now?
Not yet.
There we
We
go.
are.
Okay. So if we just look at black beans, keep it simple, and some popular varieties that we have here, our black bean yields, would have been 9% lower, for these same core varieties for 2023 than they were in 2022. So not significantly down, but slightly down. And this encompasses those areas that Joe was talking about: Bay County, Tuscola County, Huron, and Sanilac. But the interesting thing is when we just look at, Huron County, those areas where we had, potentially two crops in one, we're actually up 13% in yield. So it's kind of an interesting year. We definitely had some haves and have-nots, as far as production goes. But those areas that were blessed were definitely blessed this season.
Can you make that so we have just the screen itself?
Yeah. That was better.
There you go. Yeah, much clearer now. Okay.
Yep. So this is your Huron County yields. Those areas that Joe said definitely had a very productive year, and in black beans that was definitely true this season.
What about the navies? Do you have anything on that, Scott?
So I did not pull our navy bean data for today's discussion, but that's definitely something that we will talk about at our upcoming regional meetings as well.
Oh, good. Okay. What else did the research tell you, Scott?
Yeah, so the research this year really stood out to me, in a similar topic of what we've been discussing, that, every year is really different. A good example is black beans. We're into kind of a core variety group of, I would say, 3 or 4 varieties that really encompass our state. And typically, a few of those varieties will outperform others. But given the different, environmental conditions that we had this year, that was kind of flip-flopped a little bit. And that's something that, we'll talk about a little more at those same regional meetings. But it really spoke to, keeping diversity in your rotation. There's genetic resilience to different stresses that we have. And this year was atypical, and some of our management, beans responded a little differently than normal. So it's something that for us to keep in mind to keep a diverse rotation and do some things to help us mitigate risk, through our rotations, through our tillage programs, and through our genetic selection.
I'm seeing a little bit more moldboard plowing going on. I don't know if it's just because of the fields that I drive by a lot, or are you seeing a little bit more of that?
Terry, Joe and I had the same conversation too, and around Frankenmuth, for whatever reason this year, I have seen that a little bit more. And it's something that I always go by the saying that, occasional intensive tillage is not a bad thing. We don't want to make a habit of doing it every year, but breaking up that rotation, and if you can get under a plow pan every now and then, it's not the worst idea in the world. So I think there's been a little bit of traction there, especially when we talk to some of our organic growers. It's been more of a popular practice to incorporate into that rotation, as conditions allow.
You mentioned organic. Are we seeing a little bit more of that? Not as much, or about the same?
Yeah, I would comment with, Michigan's definitely a leader in the organic, edible bean business. Maybe Joe can comment on those markets a little bit more, as they do seem to have some fluctuation in them. But this year we felt like we had a pretty strong organic crop for the acres that we did have.
Some of the other bean varieties, we talked about the black beans. You mentioned the report is going to have a little bit more on the white beans. Some of the other colored varieties. What did you see there this year?
Yeah, so every year we test, between 10 to 12 different market classes, depending on, what's taking place in the market, and what breeders are interested in working with. Overall, we haven't had a lot of action in some of the other colored bean market classes. Genetic advancement is a little more difficult, in some of those larger seed types for various reasons. We've definitely seen the most movement in both black and navy beans. Small reds has been relatively I don't want to call it a stagnant variety market. We're still looking at 10 to 12 different varieties, but the variety of Viper that most growers who are involved in small reds know very well, is still kind of our market standard in reds. But we have some action in Pinos too, looking at some different slow darkening Pinot bean varieties, which is exciting news for us potentially here in Michigan. And there's definitely progress being made.
Joe, let's talk a little bit about some of the thoughts that you have right now when it comes to the different varieties. What is the market demanding out there right now?
Well, Terry, we spoke for quite a few months now about droughty conditions in Mexico. And I think we have, it almost feels like in the world of black beans, we have two markets. The domestic market's a little bit flat. I think most of the canners and packagers came into that with good coverage based on those early contracts that growers had a chance to participate with. And I'm going to say most of those were done at about a $40 grower level. Today, if you're an exporter and you're active in the Mexico market, the Central America market, particularly the Dominican and Costa Rica, you're seeing higher values, in some cases significantly higher values. So I think growers who are holding beans, whether that be in a pool or just waiting for the market to respond a little bit, I think are going to have some opportunities down the road. There is a little bit of concern that as you roll the clock forward to new crop, those new crop values are established already back at that same $40 mark. So at some point, those buyers in Mexico and Central America aren't going to want to carry high priced current crop into what they think of as lower priced new crop. So I think there's going to be a sharp adjustment at some point. I wish we knew that date. I think it comes sooner than probably we'd like in most cases. So guys need to pay attention to that. But we've seen some real positive moves in black beans. Small reds are the same way. I thought we had a chance of having a bit of an oversupply in both small reds and blacks, but it sure feels right now like we're going to get those things cleaned up and growers are going to have a good opportunity. You might notice that I've left navy beans for third. The story on navy beans is sort of the opposite of that. It feels like generally speaking, demand is off. Consumption is trending a little bit down. Most of the companies came in there with coverage, so there just isn't a lot of demand, if any, for navy beans right now. And you're seeing the values, sub $40 grower values, and not a lot of interest. I'm a little worried about that for next year. If we don't have aggressive contracting, we'll lose some acreage again. But there's not a good reason for an end user to be aggressive with navies because we've got enough carryover. So I think we have another year of correction in the navy market. The following year will be the interesting one. 2025 will be, to me, interesting because we may need some of those navy acres back. So, yeah, it's a really interesting time in the bean market world.
Boy, it sure sounds that way. Now, Scott, let's take a look at 24. Let's talk a little bit about seed availability. Let's talk a little bit about maybe because of that dropping off of demand of the dry beans, the navy beans in particular, producers might want to be looking at another colored bean. Give me some thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. Blacks, are always the attractive options, if we are looking at, moving some classes around. Black bean seed supply, from what I hear, is good. I know some specific varieties are, limited and or sold out at this point in the year, but overall supply appears to be good. And as I mentioned, we do have, 3 or 4 very strong, what I would call market standards, in black beans if a grower is interested in, moving to those classes. So there's definitely good options there. Looking at other colored beans like small reds, it's a narrower pool, looking at, basically one variety that's active in the Michigan marketplace of Viper. But there's options there, for us to stay in beans. And, mentioned, the pinto market too. I know it's much of a smaller acreage market, but we have some good genetics, there that really allow us to be, productive, at least, if contracts are there, to be able to support yields. So we definitely have some options, and those are things that are available. They're published. We published in early October. It's called Extension Bulletin E3465. So that's the Michigan Dry Bean Performance Trials. That's available on michiganbean.com. If you just Google E3465, you'll pull up a copy of it. And that'll give you anywhere from 1 to 3 years of yield data across 4 locations to be able to look at some of these options and really put data to a decision.
Joe, comments?
Well, Scott, I wanted to ask a couple questions. You mentioned pintos, and I'm glad you did. I think that that's an opportunity for Michigan growers. What about Great Northerns? You and I chatted about that a little bit. What did you find on Great Northerns in your plots? Yeah,
thanks for bringing that one up. It almost kind of slipped away from me. But Great Northerns, we have some real options there too. We typically thought of Northerns. First thing that comes to mind is quality issues, and second was low yield. So it had to be a really special situation to make that work for us. But we do have 2 newer varieties that I've been kind of propping up a little bit. One is called ND Pegasus out of North Dakota State University, and the other is called Eiger out of Michigan State University. And both are highly competitive, upright Great Northern beans that, for yield standards, are really competitive with some of our black beans, which is something that we haven't seen. They have ability to be direct cut, and so far in testing, we haven't documented quality issues with them. Not that can't ever happen in Great Northerns, but it's been really a resilient variety for us. And if there's opportunities there, we have varieties to be able to fill that gap out of Michigan.
You didn't mention white mold a whole lot, and I'm always curious about that. It continues to show up as our #1 sort of yield limiting infection that we struggle with. We certainly had all of the environmental factors were in place this year for a serious white mold problem. Talk us through that process a little bit. What did you end up seeing there?
Yeah, so white mold was a scary development through mid-July. As we discussed, we started to see that rainfall come, and we've seen those canopies close, and we had forecasts that were continuing to have rainfall in them. All the ingredients to make that recipe of a potential mold disaster. Thankfully we have enough, data, enough trials to really understand what we should be doing fungicide wise, in my opinion, that, a lot of our growers, they weren't caught behind the 8 ball per se. We knew we were going to have an issue. We knew we needed to get out there and spray, and we have good information on when the timing of that application needs to be made. Once we go into a reproductive stage, so once you have flowers on those beans, fungicide sprayers were moving, especially across that band of Huron County where we talked about the crop was phenomenal. It was clear that we had a crop that we needed to protect up there. And most of that crop, got at least one application. I would say the majority got 2. That was looking really promising through late July and into August. I know some growers have experimented with more applications than that. That data is still a little bit unclear on the benefits, but overall, our growers were prepared for that issue. And you never completely eradicate disease. You can only suppress it. And I think we really did the best job we could have. We had a little bit of environmental help. We had some good drying days in there that even though we had wet soils, it helped dry out that canopy a little bit. We had good fungicide protection, had good coverage on those beans. And overall, every bean field had mold in it. Was it severe? Most of the time it was not. There were some pockets that were, but we were able to kind of keep a lid on that issue well enough to really protect, 95% of our yield, in my opinion, through a lot of that, across the state. So overall, I think it's something really kind of to be proud of our growers, and the research that's been put into that, and the industry support, to help, work on this issue. Fortunately, I don't think we're ever going to completely solve this issue, but we've made a lot of progress on it, and our genetics really help too. These upright black beans, while they're still susceptible, they're much more resilient, than our old bush type beans that we think of.
I think that's what impressed me the most about this 2023 crop was the ability to realize some of the genetic capacity that these beans have today. Terry, when we were much younger, when we were Scott's age, the weather that we had this year would have devastated our crop. And I think Scott hits the nail on the head. The upright technology, of course, is a big benefit, but these varieties that we have, they're yielding, in some cases, they're yielding like soybeans with a better value. And I think growers need to take a look at that. If you're not growing some of these new varieties, there's a lot of potential there. And as long as the markets are in our favor, it's a good opportunity for growers.
It sure is. Scott, now you mentioned about research paper that is going to be coming out. When is that going to come out, and how do we get access to it?
Yeah, definitely, Terry. So there's kind of 2 main publications we have over the winter. The first one I mentioned, E3465. So that's your variety trial results. So that's what you're looking for when you're ordering seed, making those decisions. That is published. Well, then we'll have a second report that typically comes out around the 1st of February. That obtains, all of our crop protection trials. So we ran white mold trials this year in 2 different locations. We run canning tests. So if we're interested in quality, processing quality of beans, that's included as well. And also all of our agronomic work. So if we're, running weed control trials, we're running population trials. All of that information is compiled and put into that report in February. And that again is posted on MichiganBean.com.
Joe, as far as any meetings coming up in the not too distant future, anything on the horizon right now?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Terry. We're getting right into it. Scott and I have put together what we think is a pretty informative December meeting program. So we're going to kick off on December 11th. Scott, did you make a slide on that?
Correct. And I am sharing it now if you're looking at it.
All right. So you can see where we kick off on December 11th in Bay City. December 12th, we're up at the Franklin Inn in Bad Axe. Wednesday, December 13th, we're over in Lakeview. So we have 3 regional meetings. We've got RUP credits available for those, and they all conclude with lunch. So love to have guys join us, and they'll be able to see a lot of Scott's data and hear a lot more detail about it. But Scott, you left out a little data that I always like to talk about. How many plots did you manage this year?
Yeah, so this year, despite my intentions of I don't want to say this badly, but shrinking our program to be a little more manageable, we were actually up again in the actual plot numbers. And this year we ran 6,200 individual plots. So a plot is 52 square feet. Each one is replicated at least 4 times in a trial. And we had, just about 6,200 of those total spread out across the state. I measured once how many square miles we encompass, from west to Howard City to, the east side of Sanilac or Huron County and north up into Bay County. And it's a lot of coverage for those 6,200 plots. So I think that's something that, through our research programs and the Bean Commission, we have something really to be proud of.
And speaking of the Bean Commission, I was just going to say, as far as the Bean Commission goes, Joe, you got the best handle on that.
We do, Terry, and certainly this group appreciates the fact that we've got a guy here that throws 6,200 plots in the ground, gets them harvested in a timely fashion, and we already have the data off in that. We actually had that about a month ago, I think, Scott. So we can look at some of those outcomes as guys are preparing for next year already with their seed orders. So we really appreciate all this work, and I think Scott mentioned the growers were ready this year for managing white mold, and part of that's because of this data and the past research that's been done. So certainly appreciate the relationship with MSU and particularly with Scott.
Just real quick, I'm kind of curious about the Dakotas, the Mindak area. Joe, any information we've been able to glean from them on their season?
They had a real decent season as well out in the Mindak region. I think their yields are fairly average, but while I was worried about a big pinto crop that would actually hold our values back a little bit, they're dumping. I shouldn't use that term. They're able to sell a lot of black beans into that Mexico drought region as well. I said blacks, I meant pintos. So they're moving as fast as they can. We've had some infrastructure issues at the border. We've got, last I knew, we have about 130 rail cars, mostly North Dakota pinto beans, backed up at Eagle Pass. They're only clearing about 8 cars a day because the railroad is managing the empty car flow back into the U.S., which is generally got a lot of people in those empty cars. So the immigration issue has hit here at home with beans, and I don't know, we got to work our way through that a little bit, or it's going to become a problem in Laredo. Michigan relies on Laredo. Mindak relies on Eagle Pass. They're going to get messy before they get better, I'm afraid. So working our way through that. We don't need those hurdles. Those folks need the beans. We need the movement. So anyway, spending a fair amount of time talking to railroad officials at the border. Things you don't expect to do every day.
I guess. Again, those meetings coming up December 11, 12, and 13, correct?
Correct. Thank you. Right. We'll look forward to seeing everybody there.
And thank you so much, guys, for sharing. We really appreciate it. Glad we had a season to talk about. For some folks, probably they just as soon forget. But other folks had a really good season, right?
We feel pretty good about it, Terry. The way things looked through July and August, Scott and I were a little bit nervous about how that was all going to turn out. And again, there's some folks that got hurt pretty bad, but all in all, I think we're feeling like we missed a big disaster.
Given the year, I think it's about as good as we could have expected.
I agree. Guys, again, thanks so much for Talkin' Beans with me today. Talkin' Beans, a presentation of BASF.
It's never just been a field. It's a lab where beakers and vials are corn stalks and bean pods. It's 1,000 dinners on 1,000 plates throughout the world. It's the engine of the American economy. It's our survival. It's never been just a field. It's our future. All of ours. Your field is the future. BASF.